A single flight can change a life. For Brenda Jenkins, a senior flight attendant with a chip on her shoulder, flight SA-710 from New York to London was supposed to be just another transatlantic chore. She prided herself on her ability to size people up in an instant to sort the high-value passengers from the nobodies. But on this crisp autumn morning, her judgment would not only be wrong, it would be career-ending. In seat 12B sat the one passenger she should have never ever crossed, a woman whose quiet dignity masked an unbelievable power. A woman who didn't just fly with the airline, she owned it. Maybe someone like you would prefer a coloring book instead of our in-flight magazine. The words hung in the air of Phoenix Airlines Flight NA-710, slicing through the ambient hum of the engines. Several passengers looked up, uncomfortable silence spreading like spilled coffee across the cabin. The woman who had spoken, Heather Wilson, senior flight attendant, stood in the aisle, her perfectly manicured hand still extended, offering the insulting alternative with a smile that never reached her eyes. The passenger she addressed, a distinguished woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun, looked up slowly. Her expression remained neutral, betraying nothing of the thoughts behind her warm brown eyes. She simply held Heather's gaze for a moment longer than comfortable before responding in a voice both soft and clear. "No, thank you. The magazine will be fine." That moment, that single exchange on the transatlantic flight from New York to London, would change everything for Phoenix Airlines and everyone on board Flight NA-710. The flight attendant had just insulted the one passenger she should have never crossed, a woman whose quiet dignity masked an unbelievable power. A woman who didn't just fly with the airline. She owned it. But nobody knew that yet. Especially not Heather Wilson, who tossed the magazine onto the tray table with a dismissive flick of her wrist before continuing down the aisle, unaware that her career was now flying on borrowed time. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated with disrespect by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? Then this story is for you. Because sometimes karma doesn't just come back around, it owns the entire company. Dr. Amara Okafor settled deeper into seat 12B, the worn but comfortable window seat in Phoenix Airlines Economy Plus cabin. She adjusted the simple indigo scarf around her neck, a stark contrast to her light gray turtleneck and black trousers. At 57, her hair had earned its distinguished salt and pepper coloring, pulled back into a neat low bun that emphasized her high cheekbones and thoughtful eyes. Those eyes missed nothing. They catalogued the fraying edge of the seat in front of her, noted the flight attendant's dismissive posture, observed the way the business class passengers received warm towels while economy passengers were barely acknowledged. This wasn't mere curiosity, it was reconnaissance. 3 years ago, Amara had purchased a struggling regional airline using her life savings and the entirety of her late husband Jonathan's inheritance. She had rebranded it. Phoenix Airlines modernized the fleet and launched with a mission centered on one fundamental principle: equality in the skies. She believed air travel had become increasingly dehumanizing, particularly for those not paying premium fares, and she was determined to change that. An airline should lift all its passengers, not just those who can afford extra legroom, she had told her executive team on the day she took ownership. But lately, customer satisfaction scores had been sliding subtle at first, then more concerning with each quarter. Complaints about dismissive service, preferential treatment, and even occasional hostility toward economy passengers were increasing, particularly on the lucrative transatlantic routes. Victoria Bennett, her chief operations officer, had suggested sending in a team of professional evaluators to assess the situation. Amara had a better idea. "I'll do it myself," she had announced during their last executive meeting. The room had fallen silent. "But Amara, you're the most recognizable face in the company," Victoria had protested. Amara had smiled. "To the executive team and the corporate staff, yes. But to the flight crew. The people I need to observe, I'm just another face in a company of thousands. Most of them have only seen my official portrait hanging in the terminal. Besides, she'd added, fingering her simple gray blazer, you'd be amazed how invisible a black woman in modest clothing can be when people aren't looking for her. So here she sat, not as Dr. Amara Okafor, founder and CEO of Phoenix Airlines, but as simply another passenger in 12B. No executive treatment, no hovering assistance, no special meals. Just Amara observing her company from the inside out. She'd chosen this particular flight, NA 710, from New York to London, because it had received 3 service complaints in the past month alone. Specific complaints about specific crew members. The kind of complaints that made her wonder if the culture she'd tried to build was being undermined at 35,000 feet. Now, as she watched Heather Wilson's performance of customer service, all efficiency with select passengers and thinly veiled contempt for others, Amara knew her instincts had been right. There was indeed a problem at Phoenix Airlines, and its name was Heather Wilson. Amara opened the in-flight magazine that had been so carelessly tossed onto her tray table. Inside her purse, her fingers found the small leather-bound notebook she always carried. This flight was going to be very educational indeed. "Excuse me," said the elderly gentleman beside her, extending his hand. "I'm Michael Thompson. Seems we'll be neighbors for the next 7 hours." Amara smiled genuinely, taking his offered hand. "Amara, it's nice to meet you, Michael." As they exchanged pleasantries, Amara wondered what Michael would think if he knew who was really sitting next to him. But that revelation would come later. For now, she was just another passenger settling in for what was proving to be a very illuminating journey. Heather Wilson moved through the cabin of flight NA 710 with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been navigating airplane aisles for over 2 decades. At 48, her blonde bob was immaculately maintained without a single hair daring to stray from its precise cut. Her Navy uniform was pressed to perfection, the Phoenix Airlines gold wings pin gleaming on her lapel. Even her makeup was flawless, professional, and polished, designed to communicate authority rather than warmth. But it was her eyes that told the real story, cool blue, constantly assessing, categorizing each passenger into mental buckets of importance. 22 years in the sky had taught Heather to identify the passengers who mattered within seconds. The frequent flyers, the business class travelers, the elite status members. Those passengers received her dazzling smile, her attentive service, her personalized care. The rest, they were simply bodies occupying seats, human cargo to be managed, not served. "Sir, that won't fit," she barked at a young man struggling with an oversized backpack. "You'll have to check it at the gate. No offer of assistance, no suggestions for rearranging the overhead bins. Just the cold statement of a problem without a solution." "Ma'am, move along," she directed a middle-aged woman who paused in the aisle. "You're holding up the entire boarding process." The woman flustered, apologized, and hurried forward, nearly dropping her carry-on in her haste. Heather didn't see passengers. She saw obstacles or opportunities. The obstacles were to be managed efficiently. The opportunities were to be cultivated for potential benefits, compliments to supervisors, comments on customer surveys, or even the occasional gift of expensive duty-free items from grateful premium passengers. It hadn't always been this way. In her first years flying, Heather had genuinely enjoyed the service aspect of her role, but something had hardened in her over time. Perhaps it was the hundreds of thankless flights, the thousands of demanding passengers, the constant pressure to do more with less as airlines cut costs and increased workloads. Perhaps it was the gradual realization that kindness rarely advanced careers as effectively as strategic favoritism. Whatever the cause, Heather Wilson had evolved into the unspoken but undeniable queen of Flight NA 710's cabins. Junior crew members followed her lead out of self-preservation. Her fellow senior attendants either adopted her approach or stayed out of her way. Even James Morgan, the flight purser, who technically outranked her, deferred to her judgment on most cabin matters, finding it easier to accommodate her than challenge her. "Heather, we have a family with a baby at the bulkhead," Sophia Ramirez, a junior flight attendant, approached her cautiously. At 26, with only 8 months of flying experience, Sophia was still learning the unwritten rules of survival at Phoenix Airlines. "Is there a problem?" Heather's tone conveyed her assumption that there was. "They're having trouble with the infant bassinet." Heather sighed theatrically. "Some people should really consider if their children are fit to fly," she muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'll handle it." Sophia's eyes darted away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge her senior colleague. She'd witnessed Heather's retribution against crew members who crossed her impossible schedules, difficult routes, social isolation during layovers. Better to stay silent and keep your job. As Heather moved toward the struggling family, she passed a man in seat 4C, Richard Palmer, a regular business class passenger she had memorized from the manifest. "Mr. Palmer," she said, her voice transforming into warm honey, "so wonderful to have you with us again. Can I bring you a pre-departure beverage, perhaps the champagne you enjoyed last month?" Richard looked up pleasantly, surprised at being remembered. "That would be lovely, thank you." Heather's smile was radiant. "Of course. Anything for our valued passengers." The contrast was stark and deliberate. It was also Phoenix Airlines' most carefully guarded open secret. There were passengers, and then there were valued passengers. And Heather Wilson was the ultimate arbiter of who deserved which category of service. As she fetched Richard's champagne, she glanced back at the economy cabin where Dr. Amara Okafor sat quietly observing. Their eyes met briefly, and something in the woman's steady gaze unsettled Heather momentarily. She quickly dismissed the feeling. After all, what could some economy passenger possibly matter in the grand scheme of things? Michael Thompson adjusted his reading glasses and settled more comfortably into seat 12C. At 65, the retired history professor had the patient demeanor of a man who had spent decades guiding young minds through complex narratives. His white hair was neatly trimmed, and his tweed jacket, a stereotype he embraced with good humor, was comfortably worn at the elbows. "I'm visiting my grandchildren in London," he explained to Amara. "My daughter married a wonderful British fellow, and now I have 3 grandkids with the most delightful accents you've ever heard." His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he spoke, genuine warmth radiating from him. Unlike many passengers, Michael seemed to genuinely enjoy conversation, not to fill silence, but to connect. "And you? Business or pleasure?" he asked Amara. "A bit of both," she replied with a small smile. "I have some work to evaluate in London." Further up the cabin, Sophia Ramirez was trying to make herself useful without attracting Heather's criticism. The junior flight attendant moved with the cautious efficiency of someone still learning the invisible boundaries of her workspace. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform still crisp with newness. At 26, this job represented not just a paycheck, but a dream to see the world beyond the small Texas town where she'd grown up. 8 months into her career with Phoenix Airlines, Sophia was discovering that the reality of flying included challenges her training hadn't covered, navigating personalities like Heather's, maintaining composure during passenger conflicts, and wrestling with her conscience when witnessing behavior that contradicted the company's stated values. "Sophia, stop hovering and help with the pre-departure drinks in business," James Morgan called from the galley. At 53, the flight purser had the weary look of a man who had long ago chosen the path of least resistance. His thinning brown hair was meticulously combed over his uniform, impeccable. His demeanor professional, if not particularly warm. James had been with the airline for 17 years, through 2 ownership changes and countless policy revisions. He had learned that survival meant adapting to whoever held power, whether corporate executives or dominant personalities like Heather. He wasn't cruel, but his moral compass had a decidedly pragmatic calibration that pointed toward whatever would make his flights run smoothly. In the cockpit, Captain William Brooks was completing his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had defined his 30-year career. At 59, the veteran pilot had the confident bearing of a man who had safely navigated through literal storms. His silver hair was closely cropped, his uniform pristine, his manner authoritative but approachable with the right people. Weather looks good all the way across, noted First Officer Anthony Garcia, 45, reviewing the flight plan. With 15 years in the right seat, Anthony was both experienced and observant. He had noticed the subtle changes in crew dynamics over the past year, the increasing segregation of service between cabins, the occasional passenger complaint that seemed to disappear into administrative black holes. "How's the load today?" Captain Brooks asked, referring to the passenger count. "Nearly full. Business class is at capacity economy about 90%. The captain nodded, satisfied. Full flights meant a healthy airline, and a healthy airline meant job security. What happened behind him in the cabin was, in his view, the purser's domain. His responsibility was the safe operation of the aircraft, not passenger service disputes or crew dynamics. Meanwhile, in row 15, Maria Lopez struggled to soothe her 8-month-old son, Carlos, who was fussy from the pre-flight commotion. At 32, the single mother was traveling to visit her sister in London, her first international trip with the baby. Her expression mixed exhaustion with determination as she gently bounced Carlos on her lap. "Shh, está bien, mi amor," she whispered acutely, aware of the glances from surrounding passengers, some sympathetic, others annoyed. A stuffed toy dropped to the floor and Maria sighed, unable to reach it while holding Carlos. The passenger across the aisle. Richard Palmer from business class, temporarily in economy, to speak with a colleague, stepped over the toy without a glance, continuing his loud phone conversation until the very last moment before the required shutdown of electronic devices. "We'll close the deal when I land," he declared importantly. "I don't care what their board thinks, we're not budging on the terms." At 52, the investment banker carried himself with the entitled confidence of someone accustomed to first-class service and immediate compliance with his wishes. In seat 12, B, Amara Okafor observed all these interactions, her experienced eyes noting not just the behaviors but the underlying dynamics that created them. This wasn't simply about one difficult flight attendant or an isolated service failure. This was about a culture that had somehow veered away from the vision she had established when purchasing the airline. As the boarding process completed and the cabin crew prepared for departure, Amara opened her notebook discreetly. The real evaluation was about to begin. The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal as stragglers hurried toward Gate 37. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was already charged with the particular tension of a nearly full flight, passengers settling into confined spaces, negotiating the unspoken territories of shared armrests and overhead bin space. Amara watched as Heather positioned herself strategically at the boundary between business and economy class, a physical embodiment of the invisible barrier she enforced. From this vantage point, she could simultaneously monitor her premium passengers while supervising the loading of economy. "Final boarding checks, everyone," James called from the front galley. "Departure in 15 minutes. Heather nodded crisply, then turned her attention to an elderly couple struggling with their carry-ons a few rows ahead of Amara. "Sir, you need to sit down now," she instructed, making no move to assist them. "We're on a schedule." The man, clearly flustered, tried to explain. "My wife needs her medication from the bag and we can't—" "You should have planned for that before boarding." Heather interrupted. "Either take your seat now or I'll need to call the captain." Michael Thompson, witnessing this exchange from beside Amara, frowned slightly. "That seems unnecessarily harsh," he murmured. Amara nodded, making a small note in her journal. As Heather turned away from the couple, she noticed a black woman in business casual attire approaching the economy cabin. The woman was clearly coming from the premium section where she had been helping a colleague stow luggage. "Excuse me," Heather said, her voice carrying clearly across several rows. "This area is for boarding passengers only. If you're helping someone, you need to deplane now." The woman looked startled. "I'm a passenger. Seat 14D. Heather's expression remained skeptical. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" The woman produced it, and Heather examined it with obvious surprise. "Very well," she said finally, stepping aside with visible reluctance. As the woman passed near Amara's row, Heather added in a stage whisper to Sophia, Make sure you do a thorough check of the economy boarding passes during taxi. Sometimes there are mix-ups." The implication hung in the air, heavy with prejudice. Sophia looked uncomfortable but nodded. Amara felt a familiar weight settle in her chest, a dull ache she had known most of her life. The small moments, the subtle cuts, the assumptions made based on nothing but appearance. She had built Phoenix Airlines partly to create a space where dignity was universal, not tied to the class of one's ticket or the color of one's skin. Yet here it was happening under her own brand. "Quite the gatekeeper, isn't she?" Michael observed quietly. "Indeed," Amara replied, her voice measured. "I wonder if she treats everyone that way." "I've flown enough to recognize the type Michael said. They've forgotten that service is about the people, not the procedures." A cry from the bulkhead row interrupted their conversation. Maria Lopez's baby had become more distressed as the cabin pressurized. Maria tried bouncing him gently, offering a bottle, anything to soothe him. Heather appeared almost instantly. "Ma'am, you need to control your child. We haven't even taken off yet." Maria looked up, eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and embarrassment. "I'm trying." His ears must be hurting from the pressure change. "Perhaps you should have considered that before booking an international flight," Heather replied coldly. "Other passengers have paid a lot of money for a peaceful journey." A woman across the aisle spoke up. "She's doing her best. Babies cry on planes, it happens." Heather turned her professional smile firmly in place, but her eyes cold. "Thank you for your input, but I'm handling this situation." The dismissal was clear. Meanwhile, Sophia had appeared at the far end of the cabin, quietly offering Maria a cup of water and a warm towel for the baby. It was a small gesture, but the relief on Maria's face was evident. When she caught Heather's disapproving glance, however, Sophia quickly moved away, busying herself with securing overhead bins. Amara made another note in her journal, then tucked it away as the aircraft began pushing back from the gate. The captain's voice came over the PA system, smooth and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Brooks. On behalf of Phoenix Airlines, welcome aboard Flight NA710 to London Heathrow. Our flying time today will be approximately 7 hours and 20 minutes. We're currently experiencing clear conditions across the Atlantic, so we should have a smooth journey ahead. Please direct your attention to the flight attendants for the safety demonstration." As James began the safety briefing at the front of the cabin, Amara noticed Heather's performance, perfect mechanical movements with a smile that never reached her eyes. She watched as Heather's gaze skipped over most of economy, focusing primarily on the first few rows of premium passengers. The plane taxied toward the runway, the engine's hum increasing to a steady roar. Beside her, Michael had taken out a paperback history book, settling in for the long flight. "Have you flown Phoenix Airlines before?" Amara asked him. "A few times since they took over this route," Michael replied. "It used to be better, if I'm honest. There was a while right after the ownership change when the service was quite remarkable. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to be working here. Lately, though," he shrugged eloquently. "That's unfortunate to hear." Amara nodded, her expression revealing nothing, though her heart sank slightly. "Airlines are like civilizations," Michael said with the gentle humor of a lifelong educator. "They rise, they peak, they decline. It's the natural order." As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, pushing them back into their seats, Amara thought about Michael's words. She had no intention of allowing Phoenix Airlines to follow that trajectory of decline. Not when she had invested so much in its rebirth. The plane lifted into the air, climbing steadily through the clouds toward cruising altitude. Below them, New York City receded into the distance, a glittering grid of humanity growing smaller by the second. Ahead lay 7 hours that would ultimately change everything, not just for Flight NA710, but for the entire airline. Amara settled deeper into her seat, her expression serene. The evaluation had barely begun. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged off as flight NA-710 reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The cabin crew sprang into action, their movements choreographed by years of routine, a dance of clattering carts and practiced gestures. Amara observed every detail. The way Heather prioritized the business class cabin, personally overseeing their service while delegating economy to junior staff. The timing discrepancy drinks appeared in business class within minutes, while economy waited nearly 40 minutes for their first service. Most telling was the stark difference in interaction quality. In business class, Mr. Palmer, your usual gin and tonic. Heather leaned in with a conspiratorial smile, her voice warm and attentive. I've saved a lime wedge especially for you. I remember you mentioned it's your preference. Richard Palmer beamed clearly, pleased at being remembered. You're too good to me, Heather. Not at all, she replied. It's what makes Phoenix special. We remember our valued guests. Meanwhile, 17 rows back. Something to drink. Sophia's question came rapid fire, her eyes already moving to the next passenger as she spoke. Not from rudeness, Amara noted, but from obvious pressure to complete the service quickly. Just water, please, said an elderly woman. Still or sparkling? Sophia asked, her hands already reaching for the still water, anticipating the more common choice. Sparkling, please, the woman replied. Sophia's hands faltered for just a moment before she recovered, reaching instead for the sparkling water bottles stowed deeper in the cart. Hurry it up back there, James called from mid-cabin. We're behind schedule. Sophia quickened her pace. The personal touches, eye contact, genuine smiles, the small courtesies that transformed service into hospitality, sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. Amara discreetly removed her notebook from her purse, jotting down observations. Two-tier service model evident. Timing discrepancy. Business class, 8 min, economy, 42 min for initial beverage. Junior staff clearly under pressure to rush economy service. Michael Thompson, returning from a visit to the lavatory, settled back into his seat with a slight grimace. Everything all right? Amara asked. Just observing the fascinating anthropology of air travel, he replied with gentle irony. I tried to use the forward lavatory, the one near business class, and was nearly tackled by our blonde friend. He nodded toward Heather, who was refilling Richard Palmer's drink with a dazzling smile. She informed me that economy passengers must use the rear lavatories only, even though there was a queue 5 deep back there and the forward one was unoccupied. He shrugged philosophically. Class systems exist everywhere, I suppose. Amara nodded, adding another note to her book. It wasn't always like this, she said, choosing her words carefully. Air travel, I mean. No, it certainly wasn't, Michael agreed. When I first started flying regularly in the 70s, everyone received a hot meal even on short flights. The staff knew they were providing a service, not just processing passengers. He chuckled. I sound like a nostalgic old man, don't I? Experience gives you perspective, Amara replied. There's value in remembering how things were, especially when considering how they could be. Their conversation paused as James approached with the meal service cart. Unlike Heather, who continued to personally serve business class, James had taken over for Sophia in economy, allowing her to prepare the meal trays. Chicken pasta or vegetarian curry? He asked, his tone efficient rather than engaging. What's in the curry? Michael inquired. James barely suppressed a sigh. Vegetables in curry sauce. The deliberate obtuseness was clear. Michael smiled thinly. The pasta, then, please. And for you, James turned to Amara. The curry, please, she replied pleasantly. As James handed them their trays, Amara noticed the stark difference from what she had observed being served in business class. Where business passengers received meals on china with metal cutlery, real glasses, and cloth napkins, The economy meals came in plastic containers with flimsy utensils and paper napkins. The business class chicken dish she had glimpsed featured fresh herbs and colorful vegetables. The economy version was predominantly beige with pasta swimming in an indeterminate sauce. This disparity wasn't unusual in airline service, of course. Different fare classes entitled passengers to different amenities that was standard industry practice. What troubled Amara was not the difference in materials, but the difference in fundamental respect. A plastic fork could be handed over with dignity. A china plate could be delivered with contempt. The issue wasn't the product, but the people delivering it. "Remind me again, why do we travel?" Michael asked rhetorically as he examined his pasta with mild skepticism. "To broaden our horizons." "Experience new cultures," Amara suggested. "Indeed. Though at the moment I'm experiencing a culture I hadn't anticipated the peculiar hostility of those who believe service is beneath them." He took a careful bite of his pasta and nodded. Not terrible, at least. Amara sampled her curry and had to agree the food itself was acceptable. Phoenix Airlines' catering contract delivered decent quality across all cabins. It was everything surrounding the food that created the stark disparity in experience. From the forward cabin, laughter erupted, Richard Palmer enjoying some joke Heather had shared. The sound seemed to emphasize the invisible barrier between the cabins. Across the aisle, the passenger who had been identified as being in the wrong place during boarding ate her meal in silence, her posture slightly hunched as if trying to make herself less visible. Maria Lopez, meanwhile, struggled to eat while holding her baby, who had finally settled into a fitful sleep. Amara made a note to review the cabin configuration. Perhaps more bassinet positions could be added, or a system where passengers could eat in shifts while others held infants. The challenges of flying with children were significant enough without adding staff hostility to the equation. She also noted the layout of the galleys, the workflow patterns of the crew, the timing of service elements. These operational details weren't merely academic, they shaped the reality of both passenger experience and staff working conditions. If the system itself created pressure that brought out the worst in people, then the system needed revision. As the meal service concluded, Amara watched James and Sophia collect trays from economy, while Heather continued to attend personally to business class. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. One part of the plane received service. The other was processed. "They see us as self-loading cargo," Michael observed quietly, following Amara's gaze. "Not all of them," Amara replied, nodding toward Sophia, who was discreetly slipping an extra bottle of water to Maria Lopez. "True. There are always the good ones who remember why they chose this profession in the first place." Michael smiled. "The question is whether the good ones will stay good in a system that rewards the opposite." It was a question Amara had been asking herself since the flight began. She made another note in her journal, then tucked it away, as Heather approached their row, performing a cursory check that tray tables were clear. "Everything satisfactory?" Heather asked the question, clearly perfunctory. "The food was adequate," Michael replied. "The service, however, leaves room for improvement." Heather's professional smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir. Perhaps you'd prefer our business class experience on your next journey. Perhaps what I'd prefer is to be treated with basic courtesy regardless of where I'm seated," Michael countered pleasantly. For a moment, Heather seemed caught off guard by the direct challenge. Her gaze flicked to Amara, expecting perhaps an ally against this difficult passenger, but found only calm observation. "I'll be sure to note your feedback," Heather said finally, her tone making it clear that no such note would ever be made. "Anything else I can assist with?" "Actually, yes," Amara spoke up. "I noticed one of the passengers, the young mother with the baby, seems to be having difficulty managing meals and childcare simultaneously. Perhaps some assistance could be offered." Heather's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Our flight attendants aren't babysitters, ma'am. Passengers with infants are expected to manage their own childcare needs." "I see," Amara replied, her voice neutral. "Thank you for clarifying the policy." As Heather moved away, Michael turned to Amara with a raised eyebrow. That was illuminating. Yes, Amara agreed, making a mental note to review Phoenix Airlines' policies regarding assistance for passengers with infants. She suspected Heather's interpretation didn't align with the actual guidelines. Very illuminating indeed. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into the drowsy rhythm of long-haul travel. The lights were dimmed, creating artificial twilight. Some passengers dozed. Others remained awake, illuminated by the blue glow of entertainment screens. Amara had been reviewing some documents when she felt the familiar dryness that comes with airplane cabin air. She pressed the call button above her seat. It lit up with a soft ping. 1 minute passed, then 5. At the 7-minute mark, Sophia appeared looking harried. "I'm sorry for the wait," she said quietly. "How can I help you?" "Just some water, please," Amara replied. "No ice." Sophia nodded. "I'll bring that right away." As she turned to leave, Heather's voice cut through from the galley. "Sophia, what's the delay? The business class passengers need fresh hot towels, just getting a water for 12B. Sophia explained. Heather's expression hardened. "I'll handle it. You take care of the towels." Sophia hesitated, then nodded, disappearing toward the forward cabin. Heather approached Amara's row with a plastic cup and water bottle. "You requested water." Her tone suggested Amara had asked for something unreasonably extravagant. "Yes, without ice, please," Amara confirmed pleasantly. Heather held Amara's gaze for a moment, then deliberately filled the cup to the brim with ice before adding a small splash of water. "There you are," she said, placing it on Amara's tray table with a sharp motion that caused some of the water to slosh over the side. The small puddle spread across the plastic tray, soaking into the corner of Amara's document. "Oh," Heather said without a trace of genuine concern. "Let me get you a napkin." She handed Amara a thin paper cocktail napkin, clearly inadequate for the spill. Michael, who had been dozing, opened his eyes at the commotion. Taking in the scene, he frowned. "Excuse me," he said, his professor's voice carrying a note of authority that made Heather pause. "The passenger asked for water without ice. This looks like ice with water. And now there's a spill." Heather's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed. "Sir, I'm handling the situation." "No." Michael countered calmly. "You're creating a situation. There's a difference." Heather straightened, affronted. "I'm the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. I think I know how to manage a water service." "Seniority doesn't excuse rudeness," Michael replied, his tone firm but not aggressive. The lady made a simple request. A few nearby passengers had begun to watch the exchange with interest. Heather, clearly aware of the audience, modulated her voice to a syrupy sweetness that did nothing to mask the venom beneath. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable flying a different airline next time," she suggested to Michael. Then turning to Amara with a condescending smile. "Would you like something else while I'm here? A coloring book, perhaps? Something to keep you occupied?" The insult hung in the air, so brazen and unexpected that a hush fell over the immediate area. A passenger across the aisle looked up sharply. Another muttered something under their breath. Michael's face flushed with anger. But it was Amara's reaction, or lack thereof, that was most remarkable. She didn't flinch, didn't respond with anger. Her expression remained calm, her posture unchanged. Only someone watching very closely would have noticed the momentary stillness that came over her like a predator pausing before the strike. "No, thank you," Amara said, her voice quiet but clear. "That will be all." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty perhaps, or the complete lack of reaction to the insult, seemed to unsettle Heather momentarily. She blinked as if suddenly uncertain of her footing. Then the moment passed and her smugness returned. "Very well. Enjoy your flight." She turned and walked away, the subtle swing of her hips conveying her sense of victory. Amara calmly took the inadequate napkin and carefully blotted her document. Then she reached into her bag and extracted several tissues, meticulously cleaning up the spilled water from her tray. "That was completely unacceptable," Michael said, his voice low but intense. "I've never seen such blatant disrespect from a flight attendant. You should report her." Amara gave him a small, enigmatic smile. "Thank you for speaking up, Michael. It means a great deal." She took a tiny sip of what was now essentially a cup of ice with a hint of water. "Don't worry. I'm taking notes." Indeed she was. While her external demeanor remained composed, Amara's mind was cataloging every detail of the incident, not just Heather's behavior, but the reactions of other staff, the nearby passengers, the overall context. This wasn't an isolated service failure. This was symptomatic of a deeper cultural issue that had taken root within her airline. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman leaned over. "I saw what happened," she said quietly. "That was way out of line. Do you want me to back you up if you complain?" "I appreciate that very much," Amara replied. "I may take you up on it." As conversation gradually resumed around them, Amara discreetly removed her phone from her purse. Making sure the volume was muted, she activated the voice memo function and slipped the phone partially under her thigh, the microphone exposed. From this point forward, she would have an audio record of interactions, not just her written notes. The coloring book comment had crossed a line from poor service into deliberate humiliation. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was potentially discriminatory, particularly given the racial dynamics at play. As CEO, Amara had established clear policies against such behavior. As a passenger experiencing it firsthand, she now saw how those policies could become meaningless without proper enforcement and cultural alignment. "You're very calm," Michael observed. "I would be livid." "I've had practice," Amara replied simply. "At handling rudeness, at choosing my battles," she clarified, "and recognizing when a situation requires immediate reaction versus strategic response." Michael studied her with new interest. "You sound like someone who's dealt with corporate situations before." Amara smiled but didn't elaborate. Instead, she glanced toward the forward cabin where Heather was now laughing with Richard Palmer refreshing his drink without being asked. The contrast couldn't have been starker contempt for one passenger obsequiousness toward another. "The real problem isn't just one rude flight attendant," Amara said thoughtfully. "It's a system that rewards that behavior while punishing those who try to maintain basic human decency." Michael nodded. "You've just described most hierarchical organizations in a nutshell." He smiled ruefully. "I spent 40 years in academia, believe me. I understand institutional dysfunction. Then you also understand that meaningful change requires addressing both individual behavior and institutional structure," Amara replied. "Indeed I do," Michael said. "The question is, does the leadership of Phoenix Airlines understand that as well?" Amara's smile held a secret. "I believe they're becoming increasingly aware." As if to underscore her point, Sophia appeared at their row, carefully balancing 2 cups of water without ice on a small tray. "I'm so sorry about earlier," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder to ensure Heather wasn't watching. "Please accept these fresh waters. And again, I apologize for any unprofessional behavior." "Thank you, Sophia," Amara said, reading the young woman's name tag. "Your thoughtfulness is appreciated." After Sophia departed, Michael raised an eyebrow. "So there are still good ones." "Yes," Amara agreed, watching Sophia return to her duties with renewed purpose. "The challenge is creating an environment where the good ones thrive, and the others either improve or leave." She made another note in her journal: junior staff aware of service issues but intimidated. Need to create safe channels for feedback and reporting. Then, after a moment's consideration, she added, "Consider complete cultural reset." Somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, the cabin lights brightened slightly, signaling the beginning of the second meal service. The flight was now past its halfway point with approximately 3 hours remaining before landing at Heathrow. James moved efficiently through the cabin, preparing for the service. "Meal choice is chicken pasta or vegetarian curry," he announced to the economy section. "We'll be starting momentarily." Amara observed the preparation process from her seat. In business class, Heather was already taking individual orders, kneeling beside seats to maintain eye contact while discussing meal preferences. In economy, by contrast, the service would be assembly line style. A cart pushed down the aisle, choices limited to what was immediately available. When the cart reached their row, it was James who served them. He had taken over from Sophia again, redirecting her to assist Heather in business class. "Chicken or curry?" he asked Michael. "Chicken, please," Michael replied. James nodded, placing the tray on Michael's table. He turned to Amara. "For you?" "The chicken as well, please," she said. James frowned slightly. "I'm sorry we're out of the chicken. Only curry left." Amara glanced toward business class, where she had clearly seen Heather serving chicken dishes moments before. "I believe I just saw chicken being served in the forward cabin." "Those are business class meals," James explained with thinly disguised impatience. "They're allocated separately. For economy, we only have curry left." Amara knew this was false. Phoenix Airlines' catering policy, which she herself had approved, stipulated a minimum 15% overage on meal choices precisely to avoid this situation. With the flight at 90% capacity, there should have been ample meals of both types. "I see," she said calmly. "The curry will be fine then." James handed her the tray, but as he did, his grip shifted. The tray tilted, and a dollop of bright yellow curry sauce slipped over the edge of its container, landing squarely on the sleeve of Amara's gray turtleneck. "Oh," for James began, clearly annoyed. He made a cursory attempt to dab at the stain with a napkin, succeeding only in smearing it further across the fabric. "It'll wash out," he said dismissively, handing Amara the now messy tray and moving on without another word of apology. Amara looked down at the bright yellow stain now blooming on her cuff. It stood out starkly against the gray fabric, a tangible mark of the disregard she had been experiencing throughout the flight. "That was no accident," Michael said quietly, looking from the stain to the retreating back of James. "At least, not entirely." "No," Amara agreed, using her own napkin to blot at the stain. "I don't believe it was." She glanced up to see Heather watching from the galley, a thin smile playing on her lips. The message was clear. This was deliberate. Not just poor service, but targeted disrespect enabled and encouraged by the senior cabin crew. "I have some stain remover wipes in my bag," offered the woman across the aisle who had witnessed the earlier water incident. "Let me get them for you." "That's very kind." "Thank you," Amara replied. As they worked together to address the stain, the woman introduced herself as Elizabeth Cooper, a marketing executive traveling for business. "I've been watching how they've treated you," she said quietly. "It's appalling. I fly this route monthly, and while service has declined, generally, what you're experiencing seems personal." "Have you noticed this pattern before?" Amara asked. Elizabeth nodded. "It's gotten worse over the past 6 months. Certain crew members, especially her." She nodded toward Heather, seemed to have decided some passengers deserve respect and others don't. "The criteria aren't always clear, but—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Both women understood the unspoken realities of bias. "I've started flying British Airways when I can," Elizabeth continued. "Their service isn't perfect either, but at least I don't feel like I'm being actively disrespected." Amara made a mental note: customer defection happening directly attributed to service culture issues. This wasn't just about one uncomfortable flight, it was affecting Phoenix Airlines' bottom line. "Thank you for sharing that perspective," Amara said. "And for the wipes. They're helping considerably." As Elizabeth returned to her seat, Amara pressed her call button again, curious to see who would respond this time. After several minutes, Sophia appeared looking concerned when she noticed the stain. "Oh no, what happened?" "A small accident during meal service," Amara replied, deliberately vague. "Could I get some more water to help clean this?" "Without ice this time, please," she added with a small smile. Sophia nodded quickly. "Of course. I'll be right back." She returned promptly with a bottle of still water and some additional napkins. "I'm so sorry about this," she said, her voice low. "If you have a cleaning bill when you reach London, the airline can reimburse you. Just save the receipt and contact customer service." Her genuine concern was a stark contrast to James's dismissiveness and Heather's subtle satisfaction. Amara thanked her sincerely. "You're very kind, Sophia. It's appreciated." After Sophia left, Michael shook his head. "The difference between those three is remarkable. Same uniform, entirely different approach to the job." Indeed, Amara agreed. "I wonder what explains that difference." "Values," I expect Michael said thoughtfully. "Some people see service as beneath them, others see it as a calling. The former resent having to serve. The latter find fulfillment in doing it well. And which perspective does the organization encourage?" Amara mused more to herself than to Michael. "Based on what we've seen today, I'd say Phoenix Airlines has lost its way on that question," he replied.
"It's a shame. When they first rebranded a few years ago, there was talk about a new approach to service. Equality in the skies, I believe, was their slogan." Amara felt a pang at hearing her own vision reflected back to her as a failed promise.
"Yes, I recall that campaign." "Fine words," Michael said. "But words mean little without actions to back them up." As they ate their meals, Michael's chicken and Amara's curry, she continued to observe the dynamics of the cabin. Heather made a point of lingering in business class, providing personalized attention to Richard Palmer and other premium passengers. James moved through economy with mechanical efficiency, avoiding eye contact. Sophia did her best to provide genuine service, but was clearly constrained by the expectations of her seniors. The pattern was consistent and troubling. This wasn't merely a service issue, it was a cultural one, reflecting a fundamental misalignment between Phoenix Airlines' stated values and its lived reality at 35,000 feet. Amara looked down at the yellow stain on her sleeve. Like the airline itself, her clothing now bore a visible mark of the problem. Unlike the airline, however, this stain would be relatively easy to remove. The cultural stain on Phoenix Airlines would require much more intensive treatment. The next hour passed in relative calm, with most passengers settling into movies or sleep as the flight continued its journey eastward. Amara used the time to observe patterns in the cabin service, noting how frequently business class was checked on compared to economy and how differently passenger requests were handled depending on their seating section. She pressed her call button to request additional water to continue cleaning her stained sleeve. 27 minutes passed before anyone acknowledged it. Eventually, James appeared, visibly annoyed. Yes, the single word carried unmistakable impatience. "May I have some more water, please?" Amara asked pleasantly. "Still working on this stain?" James sighed. "We're preparing for the pre-landing service. I'll try to get to it when I can." He walked away without waiting for a response, leaving the call button illuminated. 5 minutes later, it was remotely deactivated from the crew panel without any water being delivered. "Impressive customer service," Michael remarked dryly. He reached into his bag and extracted his own water bottle. "Here, use mine. I always bring extra for long flights." "Thank you," Amara said, genuinely touched by his kindness. "That's very thoughtful." As she continued to work on the stain, a commotion several rows ahead caught their attention. Maria Lopez's baby had awakened and was crying loudly, clearly distressed by ear pressure or the confines of the long journey. Maria walked the small area near the emergency exit row, gently bouncing the infant, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. Heather emerged from the galley, her expression thunderous. "Ma'am, you need to take your seat immediately," she snapped. "You're disturbing other passengers." Maria looked close to tears herself. "I'm sorry." He's teething and won't settle. Walking helps calm him down. "The aisle is not a nursery," Heather said coldly. "Control your child or I'll have the captain issue a formal warning. It's a safety violation." The threat was not only harsh, but misleading. The seatbelt sign was off and passengers were permitted to move about the cabin. There was no regulatory basis for Heather's claim. Maria, intimidated and humiliated, retreated to her seat, where the baby's cries intensified in volume. Surrounding passengers shifted uncomfortably, some with sympathy, others with growing annoyance. Amara had seen enough. She stood up. "Excuse me, Michael," she said quietly. "I'll be right back." She made her way to Maria's row, conscious of Heather watching from the galley. Kneeling beside the distressed mother, Amara spoke gently. "Would it help if I held him for a few minutes? Give you a chance to use the restroom or just have a moment to yourself?" Maria looked up, surprised and grateful. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Not at all," Amara assured her. "I raised 2 children of my own. I remember how challenging travel can be." Maria carefully transferred the fussing baby to Amara's experienced arms. Almost immediately, the novelty of a new person seemed to distract the child, his cries softening to curious whimpers. "Thank you so much," Maria whispered. "I haven't had a moment to myself since we boarded." "Take your time," Amara said, settling into the empty aisle seat next to Maria's. "We'll be fine here." As Maria hurried toward the lavatory, Sophia approached cautiously, glancing over her shoulder to where Heather was now occupied with a passenger request in business class. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. "Just giving Mom a much-needed break," Amara replied. "This little one is having a tough flight." Sophia nodded, then reached into her pocket. "I have some teething gel samples from the first aid kit. They're airline approved. Maybe it would help." "That's very thoughtful," Amara said. "I'm sure Maria would appreciate it." As Sophia retreated to retrieve the gel, Heather appeared, having noticed the interaction. Her expression was glacial. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, looming over Amara and the baby. "Helping a fellow passenger," Amara replied calmly. "You can't just take someone's baby," Heather hissed. "Return to your seat immediately." "I didn't take anyone's baby," Amara clarified. "The mother asked for assistance and I offered to help. She's just gone to the lavatory for a moment." "This isn't a daycare service," Heather insisted. "Return to your assigned seat now." That's a direct instruction from a crew member. Several nearby passengers were now watching the exchange with interest. One had discreetly taken out a phone, though he wasn't obviously recording. Amara maintained her composure, gently rocking the baby who had settled against her shoulder. "The mother will be back momentarily. I'm simply providing neighborly assistance, which is neither against regulations nor interfering with flight safety." Heather's voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "Let me be very clear. You are a passenger. You will return to your seat and you will not interfere with cabin management. That is a direct order. If you get up again without permission, I will have you restrained. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Amara's phone, still recording in her pocket, captured every venomous word. "I understand you perfectly," Amara said, her voice betraying no emotion. Maria returned at that moment, looking anxiously between Heather and Amara. "Is there a problem?" "No problem at all," Amara assured her, carefully transferring the now calmer baby back to his mother's arms. "He seems to be feeling a bit better. Sophia is bringing some teething gel that might help further." Heather gave Amara one last withering look before stalking back toward business class. As Amara returned to her seat, she noticed several passengers watching her with expressions ranging from sympathy to outright support. The woman with the phone gave her a subtle thumbs up. That was quite a confrontation, Michael observed as she settled back beside him. Are you all right? I'm fine, Amara assured him. But I now have exactly what I needed, which is irrefutable evidence, she replied quietly, patting her pocket where the phone continued to record. Amara now had documented proof of incompetence prejudice and a direct baseless threat to a passenger. She had witnessed the purser's complicity, the junior attendant's fear-based inaction, and the systemic failures that enabled such behavior. Most importantly, she had confirmation that the problems weren't isolated incidents, but a pattern of conduct that fundamentally contradicted Phoenix Airlines' core values. The net was closing. As the captain announced the beginning of their descent toward London, Amara knew that this flight was about to reach its most important destination, accountability. As Flight NA-710 began its initial descent into London Heathrow, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted palpably. The crew, who had spent hours alternately ignoring economy passengers or treating them with thinly veiled contempt, suddenly transformed. Professional smiles appeared. Postures straightened, voices adopted a tone of practiced courtesy. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into London Heathrow Airport," Captain Brooks announced over the PA system. "Local time is 7:42 a.m. and the weather is partly cloudy with a temperature of 16 degrees Celsius, that's 61 degrees Fahrenheit. On behalf of Phoenix Airlines and your cabin crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We'll be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. James moved through the cabin, collecting headsets and ensuring tray tables were stowed. Sophia checked seatbelts and assisted passengers with stowing luggage. Heather supervised from the galley, occasionally stepping in to help a business-class passenger with a final request. The transformation was remarkable, a choreographed performance of professionalism that bore little resemblance to the actual service provided throughout the flight. Amara noted this discrepancy in her journal, recognizing it as a telling sign the crew knew how they should behave. This wasn't a training failure. It was a cultural and accountability failure. As the plane descended through clouds toward the green patchwork of the English countryside, Heather appeared with a basket of wrapped candies. To help with ear pressure during landing, she explained to the business-class passengers, her voice warm and solicitous. "Can I offer you one?" She moved through business class with unhurried attention, ensuring each passenger had the opportunity to select a candy. Then, with visible reluctance, she continued into economy. Her demeanor changed subtly. The smile remained, but it no longer reached her eyes. The warm tone cooled to professional politeness. Still, she moved row by row, offering the basket to each passenger. "Candy for landing?" she asked, her voice a study in perfunctory courtesy. When she reached row 12, she paused. She looked from Michael to Amara, then deliberately moved the basket away, stepping past them to offer candies to the passengers in row 13. It was such a petty, childish gesture, but it represented everything that had gone wrong during the flight. This final deliberate snub, small in the grand scheme of things, was the punctuation mark on 7 hours of disrespect and bias. Michael stared after her in disbelief. "Did she just skip us entirely?" "Yes, she did." Amara confirmed, her voice calm. Michael's face flushed with indignation. "That's it," he said, his voice low but intense. "The moment we land, I'm demanding to speak with the captain. This is the most unprofessional, disgraceful behavior I have ever witnessed in decades of flying. That woman has no business working in customer service or any public-facing role for that matter." Several nearby passengers who had also noticed the deliberate slight nodded in agreement. Elizabeth Cooper from across the aisle leaned over. "I saw that," she said. "Completely unacceptable. I'd be happy to back you up if you file a complaint." Amara placed a calming hand on Michael's arm. "Your integrity does you credit, Michael. Thank you. But please allow me to handle this. I promise you it will be addressed." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty perhaps, gave Michael pause. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You seem very confident about that." Amara smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say I have some experience with these matters." As the aircraft continued its descent, Sophia approached their row discreetly, 2 wrapped candies in her palm. "I noticed you were missed in the distribution," she said quietly, offering them to Michael and Amara. "I apologize for the oversight." "Thank you, Sophia," Amara said, accepting the candy with a warm smile. "Your thoughtfulness throughout this flight has been noticed and appreciated." Sophia's eyes widened slightly at the deliberate emphasis, but before she could respond, Heather's voice called from the galley. "Sophia, final landing checks now." With an apologetic glance, Sophia hurried away. Amara unwrapped her candy, slowly contemplating the dynamics she had observed throughout the flight. The patterns were clear, the evidence compelling, and the need for intervention undeniable. The plane touched down smoothly on Heathrow's runway, the gentle thump of wheels meeting tarmac, signaling the end of the journey for most passengers. But for Amara, the most important part was just beginning. As the aircraft taxied toward Terminal 5, Captain Brooks made his final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow Airport. Local time is 7:53 a.m. For your safety and the safety of those around you, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off." When the seatbelt sign finally pinged off, the familiar scramble began passengers standing, retrieving bags from overhead bins, switching on phones, eager to disembark after the long journey. Heather and James stood at the exit, their farewell smiles firmly in place. "Goodbye. Thank you for flying with us," they chorused mechanically as passengers filed past. When Amara's row began to move, she remained seated, allowing Michael and other passengers to pass. Heather caught her eye briefly and gave her a smug, dismissive wink, a final silent, "I win." Amara didn't react. She simply waited until most of the economy cabin had cleared. Then she turned to the flight attendant call button above her seat and pressed it firmly. A moment later, a harried-looking Sophia appeared. "Yes, we're deplaning now. Please inform Purser Morgan and Senior Flight Attendant Wilson that I would like a word with them," Amara said. Her voice was quiet, but carried an undeniable weight of command. "I'll also require Captain Brooks and First Officer Garcia to join us. We can use the forward galley for our discussion." Sophia stared at her, utterly bewildered. I can't do that. We have procedures." "The crew needs to prepare for the turnaround, and I'm aware of the procedures," Amara interrupted gently. "Now please go and deliver my message. Tell them Passenger 12B insists." Something in Amara's tone, the lack of anger, the absolute certainty, seemed to unnerve the young flight attendant. She scurried away toward the front of the plane. From her seat, Amara could hear the hushed, irritated conversation. "What? Passenger 12B." That was Heather's voice, sharp with annoyance. The one with the attitude, "Tell her to file a complaint online like everyone else." "She's insisting," Sophia replied. "She wants the pilots, too." James's voice joined in. "Unbelievable. Fine, I'll deal with this." A minute later, James appeared at her seat, his fake smile gone, replaced with barely contained irritation. "Ma'am, the flight is over. Whatever your issue is, you need to take it up with customer relations. There's a form on the website, or you can speak with a representative in the terminal." "My issue is with you, your crew, and the operational integrity of this flight," Amara replied, still not raising her voice. "I will not be discussing it with customer relations. I will be discussing it with you, Flight Attendant Wilson, Captain Brooks, and First Officer Garcia. Now, in the forward galley." She paused deliberately, then added, "Or would you prefer to have this conversation on the jet bridge, where your ground crew and the arriving passengers can hear?" James's face paled slightly. The sheer audacity of the request, combined with the calm authority with which it was delivered, momentarily knocked him off balance. This was not the typical disgruntled passenger. He exchanged a panicked glance with Heather, who was watching from the galley arms, crossed a defiant scowl on her face. Reluctantly, James nodded. "Fine, but make it quick." Amara stood smoothing down her turtleneck. The yellow curry stain on her sleeve was a stark reminder of the journey, a journey that was about to take an unexpected turn for the crew of Flight NA-710. The forward galley felt cramped with tension as Amara stood facing the 3 cabin crew members. Heather maintained her defensive posture, arms crossed tightly over her chest. James fidgeted with his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed his growing unease. Sophia hovered near the back, looking as if she wanted to disappear into the aircraft's paneling. "This is highly irregular." James began attempting to regain control of the situation. "We have a turnaround in less than 2 hours and procedures that must be followed. I'm well aware of Phoenix Airlines' turnaround procedures for transatlantic flights, Mr. Morgan," Amara replied calmly. "Just as I'm aware of the company's service standards, non-discrimination policies, and passenger rights guidelines, all of which have been repeatedly violated during this flight." James blinked, clearly taken aback by her specific knowledge of internal terminology. "Look, if you have a complaint—" "This isn't a complaint," Amara corrected him. "This is an intervention." Heather stepped forward, unable to contain herself any longer. "Who exactly do you think you are?" she demanded, her professional veneer completely abandoned now that passengers had departed. "You can't just hold up an entire crew because you're unhappy with the service." "Actually, I can," Amara replied simply. "And I am. This is ridiculous," Heather scoffed, turning to James. "Call security. We don't have to tolerate this." Before James could respond, the cockpit door opened. Captain William Brooks emerged, followed by First Officer Anthony Garcia. The captain's expression conveyed weary annoyance, while Anthony looked more curious than concerned. "What's going on here?" Captain Brooks demanded, his authoritative voice filling the small space. "James, we have post-flight checks to complete and a crew briefing scheduled in 40 minutes. James gestured toward Amara. "This passenger captain has a complaint about the in-flight service and is refusing to disembark until she speaks with all of us." Captain Brooks turned his tired eyes to Amara, sizing her up with the quick assessment of a man accustomed to making rapid judgments. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my job is to fly the plane. Cabin service issues should be directed to customer service representatives in the terminal or through our website. We simply don't have time for this right now. She's been a problem the entire flight," Captain Heather added, unable to resist the opportunity to undermine Amara further. "Demanding, disruptive. Frankly, I think she's just looking for compensation or an upgrade on her next flight." Amara didn't respond directly to any of them. Instead, she reached into her handbag and retrieved her phone. With deliberate calm, she selected a contact from her favorites and lifted the phone to her ear. The crew exchanged bewildered glances as she waited for the call to connect. "Who is she calling?" Heather whispered to James. "Security. Her lawyer." The call connected on the first ring. "Victoria, it's Amara," she said, her voice clear and composed. "I've just landed at Heathrow on flight NA-710. The use of a first name spoken with such casual authority sent a ripple of unease through the galley. Captain Brooks straightened slightly, his attention sharpening. "I need you to do a few things for me immediately," Amara continued. She paused, listening briefly. "First, I want you to issue a grounding order for the entire cabin and cockpit crew of this flight, effective immediately. No one is to be rostered for another flight until my investigation is complete." Captain Brooks's jaw dropped. "A grounding order. Who the hell do you think you are?" he blustered, his professional demeanor cracking. Heather let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "She's delusional, absolutely nuts." Amara held up a single finger, silencing them without raising her voice as she continued her call. "Second, I need you to contact Heathrow Ground Operations. Have them send a representative to meet me at Gate 27. I'll need a secure conference room for 7 people plus 2 representatives from our corporate HR department and the head of UK operations, Mr. Newman. Tell him their airline IDs and access cards are to be temporarily held pending the outcome of our discussion." She listened for another moment, nodding slightly. "Excellent. I'll see you there in 15 minutes. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. The silence that followed was absolute, thick with confusion and dawning dread. What was that Captain Brooks finally managed, his voice noticeably less confident? What kind of stunt are you trying to pull? Heather, still clinging to her indignation despite the growing tension, stepped forward. You can make all the fake phone calls you want, lady. You have no authority here. Now get off my plane before I have you removed for trespassing. Amara looked at her directly, and for the first time since the flight began, she allowed a glimpse of her true self to show in her eyes. The quiet passenger was gone, replaced by something far more formidable. Your plane, Ms. Wilson? Amara asked, her voice dangerously soft. That's where you're mistaken. She turned to the captain. Captain Brooks, my name is Dr. Amara Okafor, and 3 years ago I purchased this airline. Every bolt in this aircraft, every seat, every uniform you wear, it's all mine. So to answer your earlier question of who the hell I am, I'm your boss. And as of 90 seconds ago, you and your entire crew are officially grounded pending review for termination. The effect was immediate and devastating. The color drained from Heather's face, her expression of smug superiority dissolving into shocked horror. James stumbled backward against the galley counter, looking physically ill. Sophia's eyes widened to an almost impossible degree, her hand flying to her mouth. Captain Brooks and First Officer Garcia stared at Amara, their minds visibly struggling to process the impossible. Dr. Okafor. They knew the name, of course, the founder and CEO who had purchased the struggling airline 3 years ago, transforming it with a new vision and mission. They had seen her in corporate communications at rare company events in the official portrait that hung in the corporate headquarters. But they had never imagined that the quiet, dignified woman in economy class seat 12B could be the same person. The woman who controlled their professional fates. The woman they had just watched being systematically disrespected for 7 straight hours. Dr. Okafor Anthony said finally, his voice hushed with recognition. We had no idea you were aboard. That was rather the point, Mr. Garcia. Amara replied calmly. As the reality of the situation crashed down on them, a new sound interrupted the stunned silence, a firm knock on the aircraft door. A ground crew member opened it from outside, allowing 2 uniformed airport security officers and a Phoenix Airlines ground operations manager to enter. Behind them stood Victoria Bennett, Amara's chief operations officer, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes conveying suppressed fury as she took in the scene. Dr. Okafor, Victoria said with a respectful nod. The conference room is prepared as requested. HR representatives and Mr. Newman are en route. Thank you, Victoria, Amara replied. She turned back to the shell-shocked crew. Shall we continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting? After you, please. As the security officers moved to escort the crew from the aircraft, Heather finally found her voice again. This is a setup, she stammered, desperation creeping into her tone. You deliberately provoked us. You were testing us. No, Ms. Wilson. Amara corrected her calmly. I simply boarded a flight on my own airline and experienced exactly what any other passenger in economy class would experience. The fact that you see basic human dignity as a test rather than a standard expectation is precisely the problem. With that, she gestured toward the exit where security waited. One by one, the crew members moved toward the door, their careers and Phoenix Airlines itself forever altered by the events of the past 7 hours. The walk from the aircraft to the designated conference room was a silent, suffocating journey through the cold, anonymous heart of Heathrow Airport. The familiar bustling sounds of the passenger terminal were replaced by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whine of machinery. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. For the crew of Flight NA-710, it was a walk of shame. Each step echoed with the finality of careers plummeting back to earth. Heather Wilson walked with rigid posture, a desperate attempt to maintain a shred of her former authority. Inside her mind was a maelstrom of denial and terror. "This can't be happening," she thought, the phrase repeating like a broken mantra. "She's a liar, a crazy woman who somehow knows the right names to drop. This is a bluff, a massive, insane bluff." But with every professional nod from the security officers, with every door they unlocked with a grim swipe of a keycard, the reality became colder and harder. She thought of her mortgage, of the seniority she had lorded over junior attendants, for 2 decades of the smug, dismissive wink she'd given the woman in 12B. A wave of nausea washed over her as she realized that it wasn't the wink of a victor, but the foolish grin of someone goading a lioness. Beside her, James Morgan stared at his own feet, unable to look at anyone. Regret was a physical poison in his veins. He had seen Heather's cruelty for years. He had stood by a silent accomplice because it was easier than confronting her. He had let her set the tone for his cabin, and now he was being dragged down with her. He risked a glance at her stony profile and felt a surge of resentment. It was her fault, her arrogance, her prejudice. But the rational part of his brain knew better. He was the purser. The failure was his, too. Captain Brooks and First Officer Garcia walked with the stiff bearing of men facing a firing squad. The captain's mind, accustomed to checklists and emergency procedures, was frantically searching for a protocol to handle this situation. But there was none. A command failure. That's what the report would say. He had remained sealed in his cockpit, a sterile bubble of instruments and procedure completely disconnected from the human drama unfolding in the cabin he was ultimately responsible for. He had trusted his purser, and his purser had failed him. He imagined the review board, the cold, disappointed eyes of his peers. A career spanning 30 years, thousands of safe landings, all of it about to be undone by a cup of water and a curry stain. Sofia Ramirez felt the smallest and most transparent of them all. She was drowning in shame. Every moment she had stood by silently, every nervous laugh at Heather's cruel jokes, every time she had avoided eye contact with the kind-faced woman in 12B, it all replayed in her mind in excruciating detail. She had been afraid of Heather, but now she was terrified of the consequences of that fear. She had wanted a career in the skies to see the world. Now she wasn't sure if she'd ever set foot on a plane again without feeling the crushing weight of this single catastrophic flight. They were led into a conference room that was the physical embodiment of corporate sterility. Gray walls, a long polished black table, and chairs that seemed designed for maximum discomfort. Waiting for them were 3 figures who stood as they entered: Victoria Bennett, the COO, her face an unreadable mask of corporate steel, a woman with sharp features and colder eyes who could only be from human resources, and Edward Newman, the head of UK operations, a man they all knew by reputation, and whose grave expression confirmed their worst fears. They were motioned to sit on one side of the table, a row of defendants awaiting their judge. The silence was absolute. Victoria Bennett didn't speak. The HR woman simply stared, her gaze cataloging their every nervous twitch. The crew, once a team, were now isolated islands of misery. They didn't look at each other. They were strangers bound only by a shared impending doom. The door opened and Dr. Amara Okafor walked in. The transformation was breathtaking. The quiet, unremarkable passenger was gone. In her place stood a titan of industry. She had taken a moment to pull her hair back into a tighter, more severe bun, and though she wore the same simple clothes, she now wore them like armor. Her demeanor was calm. Her posture radiated power, and her eyes held a clarity that was more intimidating than any rage. She sat at the head of the table, flanked by her COO, and placed her small journal on the polished surface. The curry stain on her sleeve was the only remaining artifact of her time as passenger 12B. A silent, damning exhibit for the prosecution. "Good morning," she began. Her voice was perfectly modulated, carrying across the room with no effort, yet it made them all flinch. "For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Amara Okafor. And for the past 7 hours, I have had the distinct displeasure of experiencing firsthand the culture of negligence and prejudice you have fostered aboard my aircraft." She opened the journal, its small pages filled with neat, precise script. "We will go through each incident in order. Ms. Wilson." Amara's eyes, dark and piercing, found Heather's. "Your conduct was not merely unprofessional, it was malicious. Your comment at boarding regarding the credit cards of economy passengers timed perfectly as I walked past was a clear and targeted racial microaggression, a direct violation of company policy and basic human decency." Heather paled, a strangled noise escaping her throat. "Your performative sigh when I made a simple beverage request. Your deliberately filling a cup with ice when I specifically requested none. Your condescending and frankly bizarre offer of a coloring book. You didn't just deny a request you sought to humiliate. You weaponized your position against a passenger you deemed beneath you." Amara leaned forward slightly. "Was this an isolated incident, Ms. Wilson? Or is this how you treat anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of a valuable customer?" Amara didn't wait for an answer. She turned to the purser. "Mr. Morgan, you stood by and witnessed this overt hostility. Your silence was your endorsement. Later, when you spilled curry on my clothing, your apology was non-existent. Your concern was for your schedule, not for the passenger you had inconvenienced. You then lied about the availability of meal choices to give preferential service to passengers you deemed more important." James sank lower in his chair, his face blotchy and red with shame. "As the purser, you set the standard for the cabin. The standard you set was one of callous indifference and petty favoritism. You failed your crew, you failed the passengers, and you failed this company." Amara's gaze then moved to the end of the table to the pilots. "Captain Brooks. A pilot's first responsibility is safety, and their second is command. You succeeded in the first. You failed catastrophically in the second. Your cabin was a toxic environment ruled by a bully and enabled by a coward. Your failure to leave the cockpit to engage with your crew to maintain oversight of the service and welfare of your passengers created a vacuum of leadership. In that vacuum, this poison was allowed to flourish." The captain, a man of immense pride, visibly deflated the words, striking him with the force of a physical blow. Finally, Amara's gaze softened, but only slightly as it fell upon Sophia. "Ms. Ramirez, I saw your discomfort. I know you were intimidated, but you must understand that in the face of blatant injustice, fear is an explanation, not an excuse. You had options. A discreet word with the purser. A note passed to the cockpit. A call to the company ethics line upon landing. You chose none of them. Every time you looked away, you cast a vote for Ms. Wilson's cruelty. Your silence was your endorsement." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but Amara continued gently. "I hope you learn from this that courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting in spite of it." She paused, letting the weight of her individual indictments fill the room. Then she brought her hands together on the table. "My late husband and I founded Phoenix Airlines on a single guiding principle, equality in the skies. It was our promise not just to the passengers in first class, but to every single person who entrusts their safety and their money to us. It is the soul of this company." Her voice hardened slightly. "You collectively took that soul and trampled on it." Amara reached into her bag and extracted her phone, placing it carefully on the table before her. "Let's be entirely clear about what occurred on flight NA710. She said, her tone measured and precise. "This isn't a matter of subjective interpretation or a passenger's hurt feelings. This is about documented violations of company policy, aviation regulations, and basic human dignity." She pressed play on an audio recording. Heather's voice, sharp with contempt, filled the room. "Make sure you do a thorough check of the economy boarding passes during taxi. Sometimes there are mix-ups." The implication was unmistakable. Several more clips followed the water incident, the coloring book insult, the threat to restrain Amara for helping Maria with her baby. Each recording was damning on its own. Collectively, they painted a picture of deliberate cruelty and bias. These are just a few examples, Amara said after stopping the recording. I have documented 17 distinct incidents during this 7-hour flight where passengers were treated with disrespect, where bias influenced service decisions, or where company policies were deliberately ignored. She turned to Victoria. Ms. Bennett, please share what you found in the customer feedback database. Victoria opened a folder and extracted several printed reports. In the past 6 months, Flight NA710 has received 43 service complaints, significantly higher than any other route in our network. 32 of these specifically mentioned crew members by name or description that match the individuals in this room. She slid one particular report across the table. This complaint from last month details a situation nearly identical to what Dr. Okafor experienced, a passenger in economy being told their meal choice was unavailable only to see it being served in business class moments later. The passenger specifically noted, and I quote, "The flight attendant seemed to take pleasure in denying my request almost as if it was a power play rather than a legitimate service limitation." James stared at the report, visibly swallowing. He had dismissed that complaint as an exaggeration, had even joked about it with Heather afterward. Victoria continued, "Most concerning is the pattern of these complaints. Analysis shows that passengers of color, particularly those seated in economy, file complaints at a rate 340% higher than white passengers on this specific flight." "That's not fair," Heather protested weakly. "You can't prove—" "Actually, we can," Amara interrupted calmly. Phoenix Airlines' booking system includes optional demographic information that many loyalty program members provide. We can correlate complaint rates against this data. The pattern is unmistakable and statistically significant. She turned to the HR representative. "Ms. Jackson, please share what you found regarding internal reporting." The woman opened her own folder. Over the past year, 8 junior crew members have requested transfers off Flight NA710, citing incompatible working environment or personality conflicts. 3 filed confidential reports with HR detailing what they described as a hostile work environment with specific allegations against Ms. Wilson and Mr. Morgan. Sophia looked up surprised. She hadn't known others had reported the problems she had witnessed. "Those reports were supposed to be investigated," Ms. Jackson continued. "But they were marked resolved after cursory interviews that appear to have been conducted by the very individuals implicated in the complaints." In other words, Amara concluded the system that should have caught and corrected these issues was circumvented. She turned to the head of UK operations. "Mr. Newman, please share the financial impact assessment." Edward Newman cleared his throat. "Based on customer defection rates, complaints resulting in compensation and crew turnover costs associated with this route, we estimate the financial impact at approximately £430,000 over the past 12 months. The number hung in the air, nearly £500,000 lost due to the toxic culture fostered on a single route, but the true cost goes beyond pounds and pence." Amara continued. "The damage to our brand, to customer loyalty, to employee morale, these are immeasurable but real consequences of what you've allowed to flourish." She turned back to the crew. "Now I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to respond to what you've heard. This is not a formality. I am genuinely interested in your perspective on how we arrived at this point." Heather, who had been growing increasingly agitated, seized the opportunity. "This entire situation is a setup," she declared, desperation giving her voice a shrill edge. "You came on this flight looking for problems. You deliberately presented yourself as an economy passenger to trick us. Is treating economy passengers with basic respect a trick, Ms. Wilson?" Amara asked quietly. "That's not what I meant." Heather backpedaled. "But you have to understand, we deal with hundreds of demanding passengers every week. Sometimes we have to be firm to maintain control of the cabin. Firm? Yes. Cruel? No, Amara replied. And your explanation doesn't address the pattern of bias in how you determine which passengers deserve respect and which don't. Heather fell silent, unable to formulate a defense that wouldn't further incriminate her. James spoke next, his voice subdued. I take full responsibility for the failures in cabin management. As purser, the tone and quality of service were ultimately my responsibility, and I failed to maintain appropriate standards. An admirable acceptance of responsibility, Mr. Morgan Amara acknowledged. But I'm more interested in understanding why. Why did you allow this culture to develop under your leadership? James hesitated. It's complicated. Over time, it became easier to accommodate certain personalities than to challenge them. I convinced myself I was maintaining peace in the crew, but in reality I was avoiding conflict at the expense of our passengers and our values. Captain Brooks cleared his throat. From the flight deck perspective, we were unaware of these specific issues. Our focus remains primarily on the safe operation of the aircraft. A pilot who isolates himself from his cabin crew is only doing half his job. Captain Amara responded firmly. The safety and welfare of passengers includes their treatment by your crew. Would you ignore a mechanical issue because it wasn't directly related to flying the plane? The captain had no answer. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew what was happening was wrong. I tried to help passengers when I could, but I was afraid of retaliation. I'm still on probation, and one negative report could end my career. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. But that's not an excuse. I should have been braver. Amara studied each of them in turn, weighing their words against their actions. Then she nodded to Victoria, who slid a stack of documents across the table. These are the official records of today's review, Victoria explained. They detail the incidents observed, the corroborating evidence, and the company policies violated. You each have the right to add your own statement before they're finalized and added to your personnel files. The implication was clear. These weren't just notes from a meeting. These were the formal documentation of career-ending failures. So that's it, Heather asked, her voice hollow. We're all fired because of one bad flight. No, Ms. Wilson, Amara corrected her. You're not being evaluated based on one bad flight. You're being evaluated based on a pattern of behavior that this flight simply brought to light. The evidence suggests this wasn't an anomaly, it was your standard operating procedure. And that is precisely why it cannot continue. Victoria Bennett rose from her seat, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. She placed 4 sealed envelopes on the table, sliding one toward each crew member. Inside, you will find official documentation of today's proceedings and the company's decision regarding your employment status. She explained, her tone neutral and professional. Please review the contents carefully before signing the acknowledgement form. A security officer will then escort you individually to retrieve your personal effects from your lockers, after which you will be escorted from the property. Heather stared at her envelope as if it might bite. James reached for his with a resigned sigh. Captain Brooks opened his with military precision, his face blanching as he read the contents. Sophia's hands trembled too violently to even pick hers up. The finality was brutal. There was no negotiation, no appeal. Phoenix Airlines had made its decision. Effective immediately, Amara said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, your employment with Phoenix Airlines is terminated. All of you. The words landed like physical blows. Despite the mounting evidence, despite the clear trajectory of the meeting, some part of each crew member had clung to the hope of a reprieve, a final warning, a suspension, a demotion. But there would be no second chances today. You will receive your final paychecks within 5 business days. Victoria continued, all business now. Your company benefits will continue until the end of the month, after which you will be eligible for COBRA coverage at your own expense. Your airline ID badges and access cards will be retained by security. I would strongly advise against using Phoenix Airlines as a professional reference in future employment applications." Heather's face had gone from pale to ashen. 22 years, she whispered. 22 years gone in a day. "No, Ms. Wilson," Amara corrected her. "Your career didn't end today. It ended the day you decided that some passengers deserve dignity and others don't. Today is merely when you face the consequences of that decision." James signed his acknowledgement form with a shaky hand. "I understand the decision," he said quietly. "And I respect it, though I can't pretend I'm not devastated." "As well you should be," Amara replied, not unkindly. "Devastation is an appropriate response to the loss of something valuable. In this case, a career that could have been honorable but was compromised by moral complacency." Captain Brooks sat rigid in his seat, the letter of termination clutched in his hand. 3 decades of flying thousands of safe landings, all ending not in celebration and a gold watch, but in disgrace and a security escort. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, gesturing to the security officers. "We're not criminals." "Perhaps not in the legal sense," Amara acknowledged. "But you have violated the trust placed in you by this company and its passengers. The security escort is as much for your privacy as for our protocols." One by one, they signed their forms acknowledging the end of their careers at Phoenix Airlines. As they were led out individually to collect their belongings, Amara remained at the table watching the dissolution of a team that had failed not just their passengers but themselves. When only Sophia remained, Amara noticed the young woman had still not opened her envelope. "Ms. Ramirez," she said gently, "you should read the contents." With trembling fingers, Sophia finally opened the envelope and read the letter inside. Her eyes widened in surprise. "This is different from the others," she said hesitantly. "Yes," Amara confirmed. "Your situation warranted a different approach. Unlike the others, Sophia's letter offered not immediate termination, but a 3-month probationary period in a ground role at Phoenix Airlines' London Operations Center. The continuation of employment was contingent on completion of an intensive ethics and leadership course paid for by the company and regular mentoring sessions with senior staff. Why, Sophia asked, her voice barely audible. Why give me another chance when the others are being terminated? Because despite your failure to act decisively, you demonstrated awareness of the problem and made small attempts to mitigate it. That suggests potential worth developing. Amara leaned forward slightly. But make no mistake, Ms. Ramirez. This is not leniency. It is an opportunity that comes with heightened scrutiny and higher expectations. If you choose to accept it, you will be held to an even more rigorous standard going forward. Sophia nodded, wiping away tears. I understand, and I'll prove your faith in me isn't misplaced. I hope so, Amara replied. Phoenix Airlines needs staff who embody our values not just in easy moments, but in challenging ones. The choice is yours. Sign the acceptance form or the standard termination form. Either way, your future in aviation begins with this decision. Without hesitation, Sophia signed the acceptance form. Thank you for this chance, she said. I won't waste it. As Sophia was escorted out, Victoria turned to Amara. That was unexpected, she observed. The rehabilitation option. Sometimes the strongest cultures are built by people who've seen the consequences of weak ones. Amara replied. Ms. Ramirez has potential if properly guided. She gathered her notes and stood the curry stain on her sleeve, now a badge of sorts, visible evidence of a necessary intervention. What happens now? Victoria asked. Now, Amara said, with quiet determination, we rebuild. For Heather Wilson, the aftermath of Flight NA710 was a slow, agonizing descent into professional irrelevance. Initially, she was defiant, convinced her 2 decades of experience would land her a position at a rival carrier within weeks. She applied to British Airways, to Virgin Atlantic, to Lufthansa. Her cover letters were filled with confident prose about her expertise in premium cabin service. The rejections were swift and politely impersonal. The aviation industry was smaller than she had realized. A termination from Phoenix Airlines, particularly one rumored to involve the CEO directly, was a black mark that recruitment teams couldn't ignore. Each rejection deepened her bitterness and desperation. She lowered her sights, applying to budget carriers and charter companies, any entity with wings and a paycheck. In one humiliating video interview, the recruiter asked point-blank, "There is a note on your file from the Civil Aviation Authority regarding a passenger complaint and an internal investigation. Can you elaborate on that?" Heather stammered, made vague references to a personality conflict, and watched the interviewer's expression shift from interest to wariness. The call ended minutes later with promises to be in touch that never materialized. 6 months after her termination, with savings dwindling and her mortgage in arrears, Heather took a job at a high-end department store in the handbag section. She spent her days folding dust bags and placating irritable customers. Her own face now a permanent mask of bored impatience, not as a choice but as the weary expression of a defeated woman. The karmic irony was lost on her, buried under a mountain of bitterness and self-pity. She never acknowledged even to herself that her fall had been self-inflicted. In her mind, she remained the victim of an elaborate setup her 2 decades of service discarded over one bad day. The fact that the bad day had been entirely of her own making never penetrated her carefully constructed narrative. James Morgan fared somewhat better, though his path was hardly triumphant. His complicity and failure of leadership made him unemployable as a purser or in any senior cabin crew role. After 3 months of rejections, he left aviation entirely, taking a mid-level management position at a hotel chain where the ghosts of his past wouldn't follow him so closely. The transition was humbling. At 53, he found himself starting over, learning new systems, adapting to a corporate culture that emphasized customer satisfaction above all else. His aviation experience counted for little in his new role, forcing him to rebuild his professional identity from the ground up. The experience proved unexpectedly transformative. Freed from the toxic dynamics of Flight NA710 and forced to re-examine his priorities, James gradually rediscovered the service-oriented values that had drawn him to hospitality in the first place. He would never again reach the seniority or compensation he had enjoyed at Phoenix Airlines, but he found something perhaps more valuable: professional integrity and personal peace. Captain Brooks bore his disgrace with the stoic resignation of a man accepting a court-martial. To avoid a full revocation of his license, he accepted the findings of the review board and the severe formal reprimand for command negligence. After 6 months of mandatory retraining and evaluation, he found work flying overnight cargo routes across the Atlantic. It was a lonely, humbling penance. He flew in silence, the cabin behind him filled with pallets of inanimate freight instead of the passengers he had failed. The work was physically demanding, the hours punishing, the prestige non-existent. But it was flying, the only profession he had ever known or wanted. Late at night, as his aircraft crossed the same Atlantic corridor he had once traversed with passengers, he often reflected on the invisible wall he had built between the cockpit and cabin, a division that had seemed so professional and necessary at the time, but which had ultimately contributed to his downfall. Those quiet hours of reflection gradually transformed his understanding of command, too late to salvage his former career, but perhaps in time to redeem his remaining years in the air. First Officer Anthony Garcia had been the least culpable of the flight crew, but he too faced consequences. His failure to intervene or report the issues he had observed resulted in a 3-month suspension and mandatory leadership training. Upon his return to duty, he was assigned to a different route with a new captain who had been specifically selected for his integrated approach to crew management. Anthony embraced the second chance with determination and humility. He became an advocate for breaking down the artificial barriers between flight and cabin crews, organizing joint training sessions and social events that fostered a unified team culture. 3 years later, he would be promoted to captain, carrying with him the hard lessons of Flight NA-710. For Sofia Ramirez, the path forward was both the most challenging and potentially the most rewarding. Her 3-month probationary period in Phoenix Airlines' ground operations was intense, scrutinized, and deeply educational. The ethics and leadership course forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own complicity in the toxic culture she had witnessed. "It's not enough to privately disapprove of wrongdoing," her mentor explained during one particularly difficult session. "Integrity requires action, even especially when that action comes at personal cost." Sofia absorbed these lessons with the hunger of someone determined not to repeat past mistakes. She worked harder than anyone else in her department, volunteered for difficult projects, and gradually rebuilt her professional reputation. Her direct, unflinching account of what had happened on Flight NA-710 became a case study in Phoenix Airlines' new crew training program, a cautionary tale that helped others understand the true cost of remaining silent in the face of wrongdoing. 18 months after the fateful flight, Sofia was offered a path back to flying not as a junior attendant, but as a cabin service trainer, helping to shape the next generation of Phoenix Airlines staff. The position came with a caveat: she would need to share her experience openly as part of the training curriculum, making her failure a teaching tool for others. "Are you comfortable with that level of vulnerability?" Victoria Bennett asked during the interview. Sofia nodded without hesitation. "My mistake wasn't private," she replied. "Why should my learning be?" That answer, more than anything else, confirmed that Phoenix Airlines' investment in Sofia's rehabilitation had been worthwhile. She had not merely survived her failure, she had been transformed by it. 3 weeks after the termination of Flight NA-710's crew, Amara Okafor called an extraordinary all-staff meeting. Phoenix Airlines employees from across the organization gathered in person at major hubs, while others joined virtually from stations worldwide. Speculation ran rampant: was the company being sold, downsized, restructured? Amara took the stage at the London headquarters, her presence commanding attention without theatrics. The room fell silent as she stepped to the microphone. 3 years ago, she began, "When I purchased this airline, I shared a vision with all of you, a vision of equality in the skies. Not just as a marketing slogan, but as a fundamental promise to our passengers and to each other." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Recent events have made it painfully clear that we have failed to fully realize that vision. The culture in some corners of our organization has drifted from our core values, creating environments where disrespect is tolerated, where bias influences decision-making, and where fear silences those who would speak up." A murmur rippled through the audience. Most had heard rumors about the incident on Flight NA-710, though details had been carefully managed. "Today, we begin the work of rebuilding not from scratch, but from first principles." Amara's voice strengthened. "I am announcing the launch of Project Equality, a comprehensive initiative to realign every aspect of our operation with our founding vision." Behind her, a large screen displayed the project's logo, Phoenix Airlines' emblem, surrounded by a circle representing inclusivity and unity. "This is not a public relations exercise," she continued. "This is fundamental organizational transformation that will touch every department, every role, every policy, and every procedure." Over the next hour, Amara and her executive team outlined the key components of Project Equality. First, a complete overhaul of training programs for all customer-facing staff. The new curriculum would emphasize not just service techniques, but ethical decision-making, unconscious bias, recognition, and conflict resolution. Most significantly, cockpit and cabin crews would train together in integrated modules designed to break down the artificial barriers between flight and service personnel. Second, the implementation of a secret passenger program, an enhanced version of the traditional mystery shopper concept. Phoenix Airlines employees from all departments would regularly travel as anonymous passengers, experiencing the airline as customers did and providing direct, unfiltered feedback to the executive level. "No route, no crew, no station will be exempt," Victoria Bennett explained. "From the CEO to the newest hire, every employee will participate in this program at least twice annually. The view from seat 12B will never be ignored again." Third, a comprehensive review and revision of accountability structures. Anonymous reporting channels would bypass traditional hierarchies, ensuring that concerns reached appropriate authorities regardless of where in the organization they originated. Performance evaluations would be reformed to include metrics for inclusive service and ethical leadership. Fourth, the introduction of Equality Ambassadors staff members specially trained to recognize and address service disparities in real time. These individuals would have the authority to intervene when they observed problematic patterns, providing both immediate correction and longer-term coaching. This role isn't about policing colleagues, Amara emphasized. It's about supporting them in living up to our highest standards, particularly in challenging situations. Finally, and perhaps most radically, Phoenix Airlines would introduce transparency in its response to service failures. When the company fell short of its commitments, it would acknowledge those failures, openly share the corrective actions taken, and invite passengers to hold it accountable for improvement. "We will no longer hide behind form responses and vague promises," Amara declared. "Accountability begins with honesty with ourselves and with those we serve." As she concluded the presentation, Amara acknowledged the magnitude of the challenge ahead. "Make no mistake, this transformation will be difficult. It will require courage, humility, and perseverance from every one of us. There will be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt." Her voice softened slightly. "But I believe in the people of Phoenix Airlines. I believe in our capacity to grow, to learn, to become better than we have been. Most of all, I believe that we can create an airline where equality in the skies isn't just a slogan, but a lived reality for every passenger on every flight." The response was immediate and electric, a standing ovation that spoke not just to Amara's vision, but to a collective recognition that change was both necessary and possible. In the weeks and months that followed, Project Equality moved from concept to implementation with remarkable speed. There were, as Amara had predicted, pockets of resistance, particularly from those who had become comfortable with the status quo. Some resigned rather than adapt to the new expectations. Others initially complied begrudgingly, only to discover unexpected fulfillment in the reformed culture. The transformation wasn't perfect or instantaneous. There were missteps, course corrections, and moments when progress seemed frustratingly slow. But gradually, measurably, Phoenix Airlines began to change, not just in policy, but in practice, not just in marketing, but in mindset. 6 months into the initiative, customer satisfaction scores showed significant improvement. Complaints about disparate treatment decreased by 62%. Employee retention rates stabilized, then improved. The secret passenger reports revealed steadily increasing consistency in service quality across all cabins and routes. Most tellingly, Phoenix Airlines' market share began to grow, particularly among demographic groups who had previously reported feeling marginalized or unwelcome on commercial flights. The financial impact was undeniable. Equity wasn't just ethical, it was profitable. 1 year after the launch of Project Equality, an industry publication ran a feature titled, "The Phoenix Rises: How One Airline's Cultural Revolution is Changing Aviation." The article documented the transformation in detail, interviewing staff, passengers, and industry observers. It concluded with a quote from an anonymous competitor's executive, "They're forcing all of us to reconsider our approach. When passengers experience genuine equality on one airline, they begin to demand it from all of us." That was precisely what Amara had intended, not just to reform her own company, but to elevate the entire industry. The revolution that began in Seat 12B was spreading flight by flight, airline by airline, transforming not just Phoenix Airlines, but the very concept of what air travel could and should be. 3 weeks after flight NA710, Michael Thompson was enjoying breakfast with his grandchildren in their London home when a courier arrived with a sleek black box addressed to him. His daughter raised an eyebrow as he opened it, curious about the unexpected delivery. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a card made of brushed steel. Engraved on its surface was his name, the Phoenix Airlines logo, and a simple message: "For showing decency when it was needed most. The skies are yours." Accompanying the card was a letter on Phoenix Airlines stationery. Dear Professor Thompson, in a world where it is increasingly easy to remain silent in the face of injustice, you chose to speak up. Your willingness to stand for the dignity of a stranger represents the very best of what humanity can be. The enclosed card is a Phoenix Airlines Infinity card, granting you and one companion complimentary first-class travel on any Phoenix Airlines route anywhere in the world for the rest of your life. No blackout dates, no restrictions, no expiration. This is not merely a reward for your actions on flight NA7110, though those actions were indeed worthy of recognition. Rather, it is an investment in the kind of world we wish to create, one where courage is celebrated, kindness is rewarded, and dignity is universal. I hope this gift allows you to continue exploring the world and sharing your wisdom with those fortunate enough to know you. With deepest gratitude, Dr. Amara Okafor, Founder and CEO, Phoenix Airlines. Michael stared at the card in disbelief, then handed the letter to his daughter, who read it with widening eyes. Dad, do you know who Amara Okafor is? She asked, awestruck. She's one of the most influential business leaders in aviation. What exactly happened on that flight? Michael smiled, remembering the quiet dignity of the woman in seat 12B. I met someone extraordinary, he said simply, though I had no idea just how extraordinary until later. The following week, Michael received a phone call from Amara herself inviting him to meet for tea during her next visit to London. What began as a gesture of appreciation evolved into a genuine friendship based on shared values and mutual respect. Over the years, Michael did indeed use his Infinity card traveling to destinations he had only read about in history books. He brought his grandchildren to archaeological sites in Egypt, medieval castles in Scotland, ancient temples in Japan. Each journey expanded their understanding of the world and deepened their bond. But beyond the material value of the gift, Michael treasured what it represented: an affirmation that small acts of decency could ripple outward in unexpected ways. He often told his students and grandchildren the story of Flight NA710, not to boast of his reward, but to illustrate a simple truth. Standing up for someone else's dignity costs little, but can mean everything. When asked why he had spoken up that day when so many others had remained silent, his answer was always the same: because that's what humans are supposed to do for one another. The real question is why we don't do it more often. The friendship between Michael and Amara flourished over the years. Two people from different worlds united by a chance encounter and a shared belief in the transformative power of dignity. Their connection served as a living reminder that even in the most stratified environments like commercial aircraft with their rigid class divisions, human bonds could transcend artificial barriers. Michael never knew it, but his story became part of Phoenix Airlines' corporate lore, a reminder to employees at all levels that service wasn't about procedures or protocols. It was about seeing the humanity in each passenger and responding in kind. In training sessions around the world, new hires learned about the professor in 12C and the standard he had set for what it meant to be a truly decent human being. 9 months after the launch of Project Equality, the aviation industry began to take notice of the transformation occurring at Phoenix Airlines. What had initially been dismissed by competitors as a temporary public relations initiative was proving to be something far more substantial and disruptive. The numbers told a compelling story. Phoenix Airlines' customer satisfaction scores had risen by 28% overall, with a remarkable 47% increase in the economy cabin specifically. Employee turnover had decreased by 32%, generating significant savings in recruitment and training costs. Most strikingly, the airline's Net Promoter Score, a key metric of customer loyalty and word-of-mouth recommendation, had nearly doubled, reaching levels unprecedented in the company's history. These improvements were translating directly to the bottom line. Load factors were up, particularly on routes that had previously struggled to attract repeat business. Premium cabin bookings increased as business travelers, impressed by the consistent quality of service throughout the aircraft, began shifting their loyalty to Phoenix. The financial markets responded accordingly, with Phoenix Airlines' stock price rising steadily against a backdrop of industry stagnation. Competitors could no longer ignore the Phoenix phenomenon. In boardrooms across the industry, executives began asking uncomfortable questions. Why was Phoenix succeeding where others were merely surviving? What were they doing differently? And perhaps most urgently, how quickly could those differences be replicated? The answers weren't easily found in surface-level benchmarking. Phoenix Airlines hadn't introduced revolutionary new seat designs or cutting-edge entertainment systems. Their route network remained relatively unchanged. Their fare structures were competitive but not dramatically different from industry norms. What Phoenix had changed was more fundamental: the human element of air travel, the way staff interacted with passengers, the consistency of service across cabins, the genuine emphasis on dignity that permeated every customer touchpoint. They've rediscovered that aviation is a service industry, not just a transportation business, observed one industry analyst in a widely circulated report. And they're proving that service quality isn't a luxury, it's a competitive advantage. The industry response began cautiously. A major international carrier announced a service refresh program focusing on economy cabin experience. Another introduced anonymous executive travel, similar to Phoenix's secret passenger initiative. A third revised its crew training to emphasize emotional intelligence and cultural sensitivity. These piecemeal adaptations produced modest improvements but failed to match Phoenix's results. The missing element, as Amara had anticipated, was the comprehensive nature of the transformation. It wasn't enough to change training without also reforming accountability structures. It wasn't sufficient to improve service standards without addressing the cultural biases that undermined them. The entire ecosystem needed realignment, not just isolated components. Nevertheless, the competitive pressure continued to build. Passengers who experienced Phoenix's egalitarian approach began to question the disparate treatment they encountered on other airlines. Business travelers who had once accepted cabin hierarchies as inevitable now recognized them as arbitrary and often discriminatory. The conversation about service quality was expanding beyond the premium cabins to encompass the entire aircraft, precisely as Amara had intended. 18 months after Flight NA7110, Phoenix Airlines was invited to present at the Global Aviation Summit, the industry's premier gathering of executives, regulators, and thought leaders. Amara's keynote address, titled "Equality as Strategy." The business case for dignity drew the conference's largest audience. "We did not embark on this transformation because it was trendy, or because it would boost our stock price," she told the assembled industry leaders. "We did it because it was right, because every human being who entrusts their safety to our aircraft deserves to be treated with the same fundamental respect, regardless of the price of their ticket or the color of their skin." She paused, surveying the room. "But here's what we discovered along the way. Doing the right thing is also doing the smart thing. Equality isn't just morally correct, it's strategically advantageous." The data she presented was irrefutable. Phoenix Airlines' transformation had produced results that traditional efficiency-focused strategies had failed to achieve. Customer acquisition costs had decreased. Loyalty had increased. Staff productivity had improved. The financial case was as compelling as the moral one. The airline industry has long operated on the assumption that hierarchical service is necessary and profitable, Amara concluded. We've demonstrated that the opposite is true. When you remove artificial barriers to dignity, when you create a culture where every passenger matters equally, you don't just improve individual experiences, you transform the economics of your entire operation. The response was electric. Aviation media dubbed it the Okafor Doctrine, the proposition that equality and profitability were not competing values, but complementary ones. Airlines around the world began more serious efforts to replicate Phoenix's approach, some more successfully than others. Regulatory bodies took notice as well. The European Aviation Safety Agency initiated a study on the relationship between cabin service culture and operational safety, inspired partly by Phoenix's integration of flight and cabin crew training. The U.S. Department of Transportation began reviewing standards for passenger rights across service classes. For Phoenix Airlines, the industry recognition was gratifying but secondary. The true measure of success wasn't awards or imitation, it was the daily reality experienced by passengers and staff. The transformation that had begun with one disastrous flight had evolved into a movement that was reshaping expectations across the entire industry. As one flight attendant remarked during a crew briefing, "We're not just changing how we serve passengers, we're changing what it means to fly." 9 months after the events of Flight NA710, Amara Okafor was once again on a Phoenix Airlines flight, this time from London to Tokyo. She sat in a spacious first-class suite, reviewing quarterly reports and making notes on a tablet. The transformation of the airline was well underway, but there was still much to be done, metrics to be analyzed, progress to be evaluated. A young flight attendant approached her suite. "Dr. Okafor, I'm so sorry to interrupt." "Not at all," Amara replied, looking up with a smile. "I just wanted to say thank you." The young woman continued, her voice earnest. "I started with Phoenix a year ago, and in the beginning it was challenging. There was a strange culture, especially on the transatlantic routes. Senior crew members who seemed to have their own rules, different standards for different passengers." She glanced around to ensure no one was listening, then continued in a lower voice. "We all heard stories about what happened on one of the New York flights. It was like a reset button was hit for the whole company. Now we actually feel proud to be here. You made us remember that our job isn't just about serving drinks or checking seatbelts. It's about taking care of people, all people equally." Amara's smile widened. "Thank you for sharing that. It means a great deal to hear it directly from the front lines." As the flight attendant moved on to other passengers, Amara set aside her tablet and gazed out the window at the vast expanse of sky and cloud. 9 months ago, she had boarded a flight to evaluate a problem. Today, she was witnessing the solution taking shape. She looked past her first-class suite down the aisle of the quiet, calm cabin. She observed a flight attendant kneeling to speak with an elderly passenger listening with patient attentiveness to his request. She noticed a purser sharing a light-hearted joke with a young family, putting them at ease. She saw professionalism infused with warmth, service delivered with genuine respect rather than performative courtesy. The transformation wasn't perfect yet. There were still inconsistencies, areas for improvement, old habits to be overcome. But the soul of Phoenix Airlines, once tarnished, was shining brightly once more. The promise of equality in the skies was no longer just marketing. It was becoming reality, flight by flight, passenger by passenger. As the aircraft cruised high above the Pacific, Amara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had begun with a bitter taste, the sting of disrespect, the frustration of witnessing others being mistreated. It had cost 5 people their careers and forced her to confront the ugly reality of what had been happening beneath her company's polished surface. But from that difficult beginning had come renewed purpose and unexpected growth. Phoenix Airlines was stronger now, not despite the crisis, but because of how it had responded to it. The company had been forced to examine not just individual behaviors, but institutional patterns to rebuild not just policies, but culture. The flight attendant returned with a cup of tea. "Just as you like it, Dr. Okafor. No sugar splash of milk." "Thank you," Amara said, accepting the cup. Then curiosity piqued. She asked, "How did you know my preference?" "I don't believe I've flown with you before." The young woman smiled. "It's in our passenger notes system now. Little details to help us personalize service for everyone, not just our frequent flyers in premium cabins. It was one of the changes from Project Equality. Every passenger's preferences matter." Such a small thing, Amara thought as the attendant moved on. Yet it represented something profound, the democratization of care, the extension of personalized service beyond the artificial barriers of cabin class. She sipped her perfectly prepared tea and returned her gaze to the window. Far below, the vast Pacific stretched to the horizon, its surface catching the light in countless shifting patterns. Like her airline, it was both constant and ever-changing, defined not by a single moment, but by its capacity to evolve while remaining true to its essential nature. Amara had demanded dignity in her skies, and in doing so had created a new dawn for Phoenix Airlines, a future where service wasn't stratified by class or corrupted by bias, where every passenger could expect to be treated with the same fundamental respect. That flight had changed everything, not just for a disgraced crew, but for an entire airline. The story of Flight NA710 isn't just about one disastrous journey or the downfall of a toxic crew. It's about something far more universal, the power of dignity and the cost of denying it to others. Dr. Amara Okafor could have simply filed a complaint after her experience. She could have fired the crew, quietly issued a memo about service standards, and moved on. Many executives would have done exactly that, treating the incident as an isolated failure rather than a symptom of deeper issues. Instead, she recognized a truth that often goes unacknowledged in hierarchical organizations. Culture doesn't just happen. It is created and sustained through countless daily actions, through what is rewarded and what is punished, through what is tolerated and what is challenged. The behavior she witnessed on Flight NA710 wasn't an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of a system that had lost sight of its fundamental purpose. In choosing to address not just the symptoms, but the underlying disease, Amara demonstrated a form of leadership that transcends traditional corporate boundaries. She understood that meaningful change requires more than new policies or training programs. It demands a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge entrenched power structures, and to reimagine what is possible. The transformation of Phoenix Airlines offers several profound lessons for any organization. First, leadership isn't about position. It's about example. Amara didn't just tell her employees what to do, she showed them. By experiencing her own airline as an ordinary passenger, she gained insights no executive report could have provided. Her willingness to step outside her privilege to make herself vulnerable to the very problems she sought to address gave her moral authority no corner office could confer. Second, accountability must be real and consistent. For too long, Phoenix Airlines had maintained the appearance of standards while allowing their systematic violation. Reports were filed but not acted upon. Policies existed but weren't enforced. The gap between stated values and lived reality had grown so wide that employees like Heather Wilson could openly flout company principles without fear of consequences. Third, true service is inseparable from respect. The crew of Flight NA710 had confused service with subservience, believing that treating some passengers with dignity somehow diminished their own status. They had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, that genuine service elevates both the giver and the receiver. It is not about power, but about purpose. Fourth, silence in the face of wrongdoing is its own form of complicity. Sofia Ramirez's journey illustrates this truth with particular clarity. Her discomfort with the crew's behavior was meaningless without action to address it. Yet, her eventual willingness to acknowledge this failure and learn from it opened a path to redemption that remained closed to her more defiant colleagues. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us that small moments matter. A cup of water denied, a snide comment about a passenger's appearance, a deliberate exclusion from a routine service. None of these incidents in isolation might seem worthy of executive intervention, but collectively they created an environment where bias flourished, dignity was contingent, and the airline's fundamental promise to its passengers was routinely broken. In addressing these small moments with the seriousness they deserved, Amara demonstrated an understanding that has eluded many leaders. Culture isn't shaped by grand declarations or mission statements. It's built through thousands of interactions, choices, and responses that either reinforce or undermine stated values. The ripple effects of Flight NA710 extended far beyond Phoenix Airlines. As other carriers observed the transformation and its results, they were forced to reconsider their own approaches. Passengers who experienced the difference began to demand similar treatment elsewhere. The conversation about equality in service expanded beyond a single airline to encompass the entire industry. This, too, carries a lesson. Meaningful change often begins in unexpected places. Not with industry-wide initiatives or regulatory mandates, but with one person who refuses to accept the status quo. Amara didn't set out to revolutionize aviation service standards. She simply insisted that her own airline live up to its promise of dignity for all passengers. Yet in doing so, she created a model that others could not ignore, proof that equality wasn't just morally right but strategically advantageous. The transformation that began in Seat 12B ultimately reached far beyond a single flight airline or even industry. It became a case study in how principled leadership can align ethical imperatives with business success, creating value that transcends quarterly reports or stock prices. For Michael Thompson, the retired professor who spoke up when others remained silent, the experience reinforced a truth he had always taught his students, that history is shaped not just by grand figures making momentous decisions, but by ordinary people choosing to do what's right in small moments. His willingness to challenge Heather's behavior might have seemed inconsequential in the broader context of world events, but for the passengers on that flight, and ultimately for Phoenix Airlines itself, it made all the difference. As for Heather Wilson, James Morgan, and Captain Brooks, their downfall carries perhaps the starkest lesson of all, that position, seniority, and technical competence provide no immunity from the consequences of moral failure. Their careers ended not because they lacked skills or experience, but because they had lost sight of the fundamental purpose of their profession to serve others with dignity and respect. In the final analysis, the story of Flight NA710 is a reminder that how we treat people matters not just in grand moments of crisis or decision, but in the countless small interactions that constitute our daily lives. Whether we acknowledge it or not, we are all constantly making choices about the dignity we afford to others, especially those we perceive as different from or less powerful than ourselves. Those choices accumulated over time define not just our organizations, but our character. And as Amara Okafor demonstrated, they can be the catalyst for transformation that extends far beyond what we might imagine possible. Have you ever been treated as if you were invisible? Experienced the sting of being dismissed based on your appearance, your accent, or the seat you occupied? Or perhaps you've witnessed someone else being treated this way and wondered whether to speak up. The story of Flight NA710 isn't just about one airline's transformation. It's about a choice we all face every day, the choice to either reinforce or challenge the hierarchies that divide us. Think about the last time you encountered someone in a service role. Did you see them as a person or merely as a function? Did you acknowledge their humanity or treat them as an extension of the service they provide? These seemingly small interactions shape our shared world in profound ways. Similarly, consider the times when you've witnessed someone being treated with disrespect. Did you remain silent like so many passengers on Flight NA710? Or did you find the courage to speak up like Michael Thompson? It's easy to dismiss these moments as insignificant in the grand scheme of things. A rude comment here, a dismissive gesture there. What real difference does it make? But as Amara Okafor discovered, these small moments accumulate into cultures, systems, and societies that either honor or deny human dignity. The truth is, we all have more power than we realize to shape these outcomes. Whether we're executives making policy decisions, employees implementing those policies, or customers experiencing their effects, our choices matter. Our silence or our voice, our compliance or our challenge, our indifference or our empathy, each contributes to the world we create together. So the next time you witness someone being treated as less than, consider what your response says about the kind of world you want to live in. Will you look away because it's easier? Or will you find the courage to stand for dignity, even when, especially when it comes with a personal cost? Remember, the most powerful examples often come not from grand gestures, but from ordinary people making principled choices in everyday moments. Michael Thompson didn't deliver an impassioned speech or stage a protest. He simply spoke up quietly but firmly when he saw someone being mistreated. That small act of courage created space for others to recognize and challenge the injustice unfolding before them. You have that same power. Every time you choose respect over convenience, empathy over indifference, dignity over hierarchy, you help create a culture where equality isn't just an aspiration, but a lived reality. It may not transform an entire industry overnight, but it will change something just as important: the immediate experience of the people whose paths cross yours. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. That transforming our world doesn't require special authority or exceptional circumstances. It simply requires the willingness to see the humanity in every person we encounter, and the courage to honor that humanity through our words and actions. What kind of difference will you make today? True power isn't about position, title, or authority. It isn't announced with a loud voice or enforced through intimidation. True power lies in dignity, both in recognizing your own worth and in honoring the inherent value of every person you encounter. Heather Wilson thought she held power on Flight NA-710. She had seniority, a uniform, and 2 decades of experience. She wielded these like weapons, using them to elevate some passengers while diminishing others. But her power was an illusion, brittle, dependent on external validation, and ultimately self-defeating. Amara Okafor demonstrated a different kind of power. Not the power to humiliate or control, but the power to transform. She didn't need to raise her voice or make threats. Her dignity remained intact even when others tried to strip it away. She understood that respect isn't something to be rationed or reserved for the privileged few. It's a renewable resource that grows stronger with use. The contrast between these two approaches to power couldn't be more stark. One led to professional disgrace and personal bitterness. The other created a revolution that extended far beyond a single flight or airline. This isn't just a lesson for corporate executives or service professionals. It's a truth that applies to every human interaction, from family dynamics to community relationships to global politics. When we base our sense of worth on diminishing others, we create systems that are inherently unstable and ultimately unsatisfying, even for those who seem to benefit from them. But when we recognize that dignity is universal, not a zero-sum game where some must lose so others can win, we open possibilities for transformation that benefit everyone. The story of Flight NA-710 reminds us that justice doesn't always arrive with dramatic pronouncements or public confrontations. Sometimes it walks quietly down an airplane aisle, observing carefully, documenting meticulously, and responding strategically. It doesn't seek revenge or humiliation, but accountability and change. Karma, like gravity, eventually brings everyone back to Earth, not through mystical forces, but through the natural consequences of how we treat others. Heather Wilson didn't lose her career, because Amara Okafor was powerful. She lost it because her own actions were fundamentally unsustainable. A system built on disrespect and hierarchy will inevitably collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The legacy of Flight NA710 isn't just about an airline that changed its practices or passengers who received better service. It's about the recognition that dignity isn't a luxury to be earned through status or purchased with a premium ticket. It's the birthright of every human being, regardless of appearance, background, or circumstance. That recognition, once it takes root, changes everything, not through dramatic upheaval, but through the quiet revolution of treating each person we encounter with the respect they inherently deserve. It transforms not just organizations but individuals, not just policies but hearts. So the next time you find yourself in a position to either extend or withhold dignity from another person, whether you're a CEO or a cashier, a flight attendant, or a passenger, remember this. The choice you make in that moment defines not just their experience, but your own character. Choose wisely, for in that choice lies the power to either diminish or elevate our shared humanity. True power, like true dignity, doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It simply acts with quiet assurance, knowing that justice, while sometimes delayed, is never ultimately denied. And that even the smallest stand for human dignity can spark changes that extend far beyond what we might imagine possible. What did you think of Heather's downfall? Was the firing of the entire crew justified, or was it too severe a consequence for a single flight's failings? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been in a situation similar to Amara's where you experienced disrespect based on assumptions about who you were? Or perhaps you've been in Sophia's position, witnessing wrongdoing but feeling powerless to stop it. Your stories matter, and sharing them helps others recognize that they're not alone in these experiences. Maybe you've been the Michael Thompson in someone else's story, the person who spoke up when others remained silent. What gave you the courage to act? What difference did it make? Your example could inspire others to find their voice in similar situations. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that dignity shouldn't depend on the class of your ticket or the color of your skin, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear its message. Our collective conversation about these issues is what ultimately drives change in aviation and business and in our broader society. And if you want to see more stories of accountability transformation and unexpected twists, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're committed to bringing you content that not only entertains but challenges us all to reflect on the kind of world we want to create together. Remember, every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce or challenge the barriers that divide us. The choice is yours. What kind of difference will you make today? Thank you for listening to the story of Flight NA710, where one woman's quiet dignity changed not just an airline, but an entire industry. Until next time, may your own journeys be filled with respect, kindness, and the recognition of our shared humanity.